So, first of all, I'd like to express my thanks and to share how thankful and privileged I am to be here in this hall, in the exhibition, that the gallery and the team here at the gallery has worked so hard and merits all the success that it has achieved with this exhibition. I'm sorry to ruin your experience of the exhibition. I didn't know I'd be giving my presentation here. This orange is awful, but hopefully it will keep you a bit awake for the first few minutes until I get you all curious about what I'll be sharing with you. My talk is in a way informed by the essay that I've written on the invitation of the gallery, which is published in the catalog, and I've tried to look at Marka Šagala, at this important seminal 20th century artist, but from a different perspective. Usually, with a background in art history, we tend to look at a work of art in terms of its cultural significance, its value, its importance within the broader art historical history or narrative of things. I'll be looking at it differently. I'll be using one of his portraits, one of his self-portraits, as evidence. I'm quite a curious person. Probably Kada has mentioned that my work is mostly with museums. And in fact, I present myself as a museum thinker, although I'm an art historian by academic formation as well. So I'll be using this self-portrait as evidence to understand what we mean when we use the term migration aesthetics. Is there such a thing as an aesthetics of migration? And what would that be if there is such a thing? Is the migrant artist someone specific? Does he have a specific character? Does he have a specific approach to aesthetics? Does he work differently from the rest who are not migrants? Does he look at things differently? How does his mindset as an artist comes to be? And that's what's going to inform my hour, a bit less, talk with you today, sharing ideas, thoughts, provocations, and reflections. Well, first of all, I'd like to start with this visual, which is the work of a Maltese photographer. I come from Malta. It's an island at the center of the Mediterranean, and our understanding, the Maltese understanding of migration is this experience. He's a photographer. He spends his time on rescue boats, on rescue missions, picking up migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, crossing to Europe. So migration is or has a subjective interpretation depending on your context, on where you live, on where you have been born, on your geographic context. And this is perhaps for the Mediterranean the stereotypical understanding of migration, which is about pressures, which is about legality or illegality. Migration can go beyond, because migration can be also understood as a process. We can understand migration as the trip or the journey between point A and point B. You leave point A to settle in point B. But then, migration could be much more complex. And we'll be looking at that, and trying to understand how migration can also be a complex journey with multinodal points of arrival and departure. The The methodology I'll be using before I introduce you to this gentleman here is informed by what we call visual literacy. Visual literacy is about reading images. It's something that museums have been using quite frequently over the past few years. It's literally about looking at the visual, looking at the image, and literally extracting information from that visual, very much like an excavation work. You literally examine the painting at close quarters, you read what the symbols and the signs are, and you try to understand the meaning behind those signs and symbols. And this is what I shall be doing. So let me first introduce you to this gentleman here. This is Marka Šagala. And I'd like to very briefly introduce his travels, his migration over the years from one city to the other, and his identity. Because Marka Šagala is Jewish, and he was born in a place which the town is called, the name of the town is Vitebsk. And in Vitebsk, in pre-Second World War, pre-First World War even, Vitebsk, the Jewish population in this city was roughly 52%. So he was born in a city that is in today Belarusia, but within a very strong, very well-established Jewish community that survived right up to 1941. In fact, there is what has become known as the Vitebsk Jewish or the Vitebsk Ghetto massacre, where most of the Jewish community in this city were literally exterminated by the Nazis during their advance into Russia. So he's born in this city within a Jewish community. The date is 1887. He frequented the Jewish elementary school, and then he went on to continue his studies in the local public school. So a Jewish child born within a very well-established Jewish community, but in Belarus. Then in 1907 he moves to St. Petersburg. And later, in 1910, he moves to Paris. And these 4 years, to which the portrait that I shall be examining, in a way even forensically, if we can also present it that way, is a defining moment. These 4 years are a defining moment of his career. And what he produced at this point in time is very much what defines his style and his artistic career. 4 years later, he moves to Berlin, where he has his first solo show, then back to Vitebsk, just round about when World War I began, and then in 1922, right after the First World War, he leaves for Berlin. In 1923, he's in Paris with his wife and children. And during the interwar period, he travels to Bretagne, the south of France, Palestine. Then between 1932 and 1937, he's in Holland, Spain, Poland, and Italy. And in 1941, then, because of the Second World War and the advance of the Nazi regime into France and Europe, he leaves for the US to return back in 1948. So, in a way, we have what has come to be described and understood as the wandering Jew. This interesting story, which is known, from what we know about the story, it seems to be a 13th century legend which states that a Jew by the name of Cartaphilus taunts Jesus on his way to the crucifixion, and he was sort of accused or cursed, if we can use the word, to walk the earth, to wander around the earth until the second coming of Christ. So, in a way, Chagall is a very good example of this wandering Jew. Someone who is born in Belarusia within a Jewish community, but it is an identity which does not have deep roots, because the Jews recognized Jerusalem and Palestine as their home, as their homeland, and who spent his life wandering from one city to another. This is the visual that Gustave Doré published, actually produced during the mid-19th century, and that's a version of it which describes this story, which is a visual rendition of the story of the wandering Jew. That's the landscape of Vivetsky, and in most of his works, in most of Chagall's works, and you can see quite an exceptional selection here in the exhibition, there's always this sense of detachment. The figures don't have roots, they are hovering, they are not grounded, which is in a way a statement referring to identity. Although they inhabit the place, they are not connected to a homeland. The homeland is the biblical homeland in Palestine. And in my essay, just a footnote, I also refer to this gentleman by the name of Blaise Cendaras. That's a photo of his. In fact, I quote a poem that he wrote in response to his portrait, to Chagall's portrait that we shall be discussing in a few minutes, and I quote him. He says, "He paints with all the dirty passions of a little Jewish town, with all the exacerbated sexuality of provincial Russia for France. Three different identities: Jewish, Russia, and France." Blaise, whose original name is Frederick Louis Saussure, he's Swiss, and he was a very good friend of Chagall. He also recognizes the early modernist movement in Paris at this point in time, when Chagall paints this portrait between 1910 and the mid-1920s, slightly later after Chagall returns back to Russia and then on to other places. He defines this period as the genuine period of discovery in the arts. I'd like to divert a bit here, because Chagall defines himself as a start as a Jewish artist. And in fact, I'm quoting him, where he says that, "I think that perhaps I created a few pictures that might give me the right to call myself a Jewish painter. But then, in 1923, in a German magazine, Der Sturm, he's described as being Russian. In 1937, he's described as being French. And Blaise Cendaras' poem also refers to this triple identity. So, who is Chagall then? Is he Jewish? Is he French? Is he Russian? In a way, it's the country or the French or the Russians that are claiming him, that are reclaiming him, that are claiming him as being Jewish. That are claiming him as being French or being Russian. It is a subjective understanding of what the identity of this artist is. But I'd like to share something which is essentially a statement, I'm going to divert a bit, about identity and the complex arguments around identity. And I'm going to present you this artist who lived much, much before Chagall's times, but which his story, the story that I'm going to share with you, is a contemporary story to Chagall's. Because Hans Holbein, the younger, is considered to be the national artist or the most important artist in England. The reason behind this is because his portraits, the greatest majority of which were painted in England, represent English personalities of the Reformation, of the time of Henry VIII, when England took a stand against the papacy and split from Christian Europe. A very bold statement for a country on the periphery of Europe. It was not the empire that it had to lead or be at the center of in later centuries. And the problem with Hans Holbein is that the British and the English found themselves in a situation whereby they're at war with Nazi Germany, and the most important artist standing for their identity, for the national identity, is essentially German, because he was born in Bavaria. And there are interesting statements whereby the English and the British academic world tries to mellow this and tries to find ways how to juggle identity. It's the other side of the coin in a way. In the case of Chagall, there's a claim that he's Russian, that he's French, even by his friends. In the case of Hans Holbein, there's an effort to find ways how to keep him at arm's length without losing the sense of identity that he stands for. And I'm going to quote what was actually published in the Burlington magazine, the most important magazine for arts in the United Kingdom. And they say in 1945, for many years, he's usually classified as an artist of the Swiss school. It's not German, it's Swiss. And then they sort of mellow it down. Was more successful than most Germans in entering into the British point of view. So yes, he's German, but we can sort of domesticate him. He has no connection with our understanding of Nazi Germany. So it's the other side of the coin, and it's a way how identity can also be a scene, a situation, a circumstances, which is juggled and juxtaposed between different points, between different perspectives. In the case of Chagall, there is no such a situation, and he is claimed to be what he is claimed to be: Russian, French, and Jewish. His identity, the main identity that he stands for. But let's come to the portrait now. This is the portrait the self-portrait that Chagall paints in Paris. It is one of the earliest works that he paints when he arrives in Paris, and we shall look at it closely to try to understand what his statement is here. All that we see here stands for statements, comments, reflections, episodes and circumstances that he experienced. So we see him at his easel, painting a work of art. There is his Russian home or homeland in a cloud, and on the other side there is a nocturnal scene of Paris with the symbol par excellence of Paris, the Tour Eiffel. And right next to him, there is a reference to an incident that happened in Paris. That's someone by the name of Franz Richet, who had invented the first parachute and was so convinced that it would succeed, that his invention would actually be successful, that he decided to test it out himself. And he fell to his death from the Eiffel Tower. If you look up YouTube, there are gruesome, I have to warn you, there are gruesome bits and pieces of video which show Franz Reichelt jumping to his death from the Eiffel Tower. What is also interesting is the text that you see right on top, which is written in Yiddish, but which refers to Chagall's two homelands, Russia and Paris. So that's the work of art that Chagall is painting on his easel, which is a work that he painted right before painting his portrait. What is also interesting, and I think is the next slide, yes, that's it, is that his understanding of Cubism is not yet clear. He is trying to come to terms with this style that was gaining ground and gaining popularity in Paris in 1910. But then again, you can notice that it's more of a juxtaposition of shapes and forms rather than the analytical cubism that we see in that image. So in a way, he's reacting to his environment, and he's trying to literally come to terms with this new idea of what this style is all about. And now I'd like to introduce the next part, which is essentially what we think about migration. I've forgotten a very important thing, which was also mentioned on social media. It's the 7 fingers. The reference to the 7 fingers is a reference to the Yiddish idiom. I try to read in Yiddish, Mitel 7 Finger, which translates with all 7 fingers. So it's a statement on the aspiration to perfection, to being perfect. 7 is the perfect number. So he's modifying the shape of his hand in order to make a statement that he is literally really working hard to achieve quality, perfection, excellence. That is a detail which I would not want to miss. But what then is migration? Before we really delve into the mindset behind this work. And I think we can start from the etymological root of the word, which is about migrare, migration, which strictly speaking is migration, moving from point A to point B. But then it could also refer to the idea of wandering. Now I refer back to the wandering Jew, or to Rome. And Chagall did Rome, and how? Moving from one city to another according to circumstances. I'd like to take the argument even further, because there is a Anglo-German geographer by the name of Ernst Georg Ravenstein, who in his Laws of Migration, it was published in 1885, puts forward a classification of migration. And he talks about 5 categories which refer to local migration, short journey migration, long journey migrants, those migrating in stages, and temporary migrants. So we're already in a situation where migration is way beyond departing point A to arrive at point B because of circumstances, because of pressures, because of many other reasons, but it's more articulate than that. And I'd like to take you a little bit back now to the early modern period. I'd like to share with you what these three artists stand for in terms of migration, taking Ernst George Ravenstein's classification, five-stage classification, 5 categories, as our point of departure. So the artist at the top is Giotto da Bondone. He's a Renaissance artist, a Florentine, and another artist by the name of Giorgio Vasari, who wrote a very important book entitled The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, refers to the fact that much of his success, much of his credibility rested on his experience in travel and movement. He traveled, we're talking of the early 16th century here. He traveled around the world. He was moving the world of those times, his context more than the world, and that gave him a plus. That stood for status and an acknowledgement of ability. He was more cultured, more knowledgeable because of the fact that he had traveled, he had migrated. If we take George Ravenstein's 5 categories, he was moving, a temporary migrant from one city to another, very much like Chagall, moving all the time. The other artist's name is Federico Zuccari. And in his book, another book, published in 1608, the title of this book is Il passaggio per l'Italia. And he speaks about the various things experienced, seen, and done in his leisure in Venice, Mantova, Milan, Pavia, Turin, and other parts. So another artist who is migrating in a temporary way to discover the world, the artistic world of his times. The other personality is Antonio Filarete, another Italian, who wrote a treatise on architecture. And I'm quoting him here because there is also the other side of the coin to migrant artists and to the aesthetics of migration, because it refers to the fact that someone from outside, bringing influences from outside, might also be acknowledged as corruptive. These are new ideas, these goes against our traditions, so he should not be trusted, he should not be acknowledged. There's also the other side of the coin. And Antonio Filarete refers to the Gothic style, for example, when it arrived in Italy, as something that only barbaric people could have brought it into Italy. So something coming from outside, and these migrant artists coming from outside, he's acknowledging them as being barbaric. They shouldn't be allowed inside. Now, going back to the portrait, in more recent times, obviously, this is much more. It's much more dictated by the art market. Modern artists travel because they need to showcase their works in fairs, in exhibitions. So we have the same context of discovery, which is taken forward, pushed forward in terms of needs and circumstances. But I'd like to move on now to discuss 2 lenses as to how we can understand the identity of the migrant artist. And the first lens is language. If there's anything that defines us, if there's anything that stands for our identity, that is language. In most circumstances, especially in the case of conflicts, language is something that is always, more often than not, rather than always, more often than not, on the negotiating table. The use of our language, especially in the case of minorities, needs to be protected. We need to ensure, we're very keen on ensuring that our language, in the case of minorities in your country, has to be endorsed. It has to be allowed as a language. Language is an identity construct, a very important, very powerful identity construct. In my case, coming from Malta, for example, until the 1930s, Italian was one of the official languages. And the British colonial authorities, because of the vicinity that the islands had to Italy, pushed very hard to shift, to dodge, to remove the Italian language and its use in Malta, and pushing English and Maltese. And this created lots of friction, because the idea was to sever all possible cuts, because of political circumstances, with mainland Italy. And there are very many other circumstances, even in recent times. So, how does language come into the picture when we talk of a transnational individual, someone who is born Jewish but speaks Russian, someone who then moves to Paris and obviously has to also engage with French. So, more often than not, we talk of language as being something that defines a transnational individual. In the case of migrants, more often than not, they would have their original language, their language which they would have learned at birth and during their infancy, and then they would acquire another language, and this would shape their identity, this translingual combination. So, in the case of Chagall, as he's moving from one country to country, following his first year stint in Paris, where he paints this portrait, taking the language idea as our point of departure, each successive stay would have shaped and informed and been informed by the context which he chooses to engage with from time to time. So he absorbs French culture, he absorbs a French way of looking at things, although he's not yet so sure how to engage with abstract ideas, abstract aesthetic ideas. But he's always taking on new perspectives, new cultural constructs, new iconographies. Much like language. There's your native language, but then as you move as a migrant, you also acknowledge, you endorse, you absorb, you take in another language. Does that mean that you're French if you decide to migrate to France? Does it mean that, irrespective of what your new language is, you're still Russian if you were born in Russia, or if you're Jewish? Or does it mean that you're someone else, someone which combines the two? In the case of Chagall, I think that his identity would still be Jewish at core, but it would be increasingly morphing over time into Jewish, French, Russian, and later American. Is he just Jewish? Is he also American? Is he French? What is this artist's identity? What does he stand for? The other lens that I would like to engage with is liminality. And here I would like to introduce you to these two personalities. One of them is Arnold van Gennep, and the other one is Victor Turner. So I'd like to look at Chagall now from a theoretical framework. I try to be as simple as possible. I try to explain in very simple terms as to what we understand by liminality. So, Genep defines liminality as a rite of passage, starting from one context to a middle context to a final stage. So in the first stage there is separation. Someone detaches himself from the context from which he is born, and he moves to a state, the second stage, which is a state of in-betweenness. He's not Jewish or Russian. He's moved to France, but he's somewhere in between. He is still Russian, but not quite, because he's absorbing new ideas, new trends, but he still needs to move even closer. The third stage would be the stage of aggregation, where this new identity is taking shape. What is really interesting is the stage of in-betweenness, which Victor Turner speaks about, the middle stage, which he also calls betwixt and between. He's somewhere in between. So to simplify this, it's huge, sorry, but it is a synthesis of what I'm trying to explain here. He's no longer here, but he's not yet quite there. He's somewhere in between. He's liminal. But this state could also be permanent. We can think of someone whose identity is liminal, is permanently liminal. He's not just Russian, he's also French, but not quite. He's also American, but not quite. He's an amalgam of all his life experiences. And in the case of Chagall, we have an extreme case because he's been traveling so much all over the world that the amalgam of liminality is huge. So it's a very clear case study that we can actually discuss. So as the artist departs from the homeland to transition to a home, he is caught in betwixt and between in this permanent state of liminality. And that's the artist, very much like in the case of an artist who comes to inhabit this two lingua cultural ideas, two lingua cultural terms, in terms of language as an identity. So does this manifest itself in visual state, a hybridity which is prone to creativity. He's left his original context, he's absorbing new ideas, new experiences, new aesthetic languages, and he's becoming a completely different artist, which is difficult to locate on one side, on the other, or elsewhere. There's a uniqueness in the migrant artist, which is what we talk about when we mention migration aesthetics. So in a way, the production of the diaspora artist is much richer, more articulate and elaborate, as it draws from the home towards which the artist moves over time. Obviously, if he moves from point A to point B, there is a measure of influence and richness. If he moves much more and travels much more, then it's much more richer. In the case of Chagall, this liminality is very layered, extraordinarily layered, and informs an identity which is complex, very complex. Although it is still Jewish at core in a way, but Jewishness is in a sense also detached. There is no homeland. There is home. Homeland for the Jews, as I mentioned, the idea of the wandering Jew is Palestine. So, what can we conclude then? And I start to slowly conclude. I think that, as I've just mentioned, migration aesthetics is a very rich aesthetic experience because it draws from all the sources and influence to which it connects. It goes beyond the idea of homeland. An artist can still acknowledge himself as being Jew, but his style, his aesthetic language goes way, way beyond. There are also two other reflections that I'd like to share with you. And I think that it is very difficult to measure the aesthetic of migration within the idea of a core-periphery relationship. We tend to understand art, Renaissance art, as acknowledging the yardstick of what was happening in Italy, for example. And until recently, it was just Italy. We didn't even acknowledge the Northern European Renaissance, for example. There are also regional realities. There's a Renaissance, a 15th century Renaissance in Sicily, in the south of Italy. And at the end of the day, what is Renaissance? Is it a yardstick that has been invented by Italian art historians or German art historians? Should we rethink our classification? When we look at migrant artists and the aesthetics of migration, with such richness, with so much layering, with so much influences, aesthetic influences, how can we measure this? Can we really consider the strength and the wealth and the richness of this language just by looking at the core periphery circumstance? I think there is much more. And I think there is the need to align with a universal yardstick, certainly much more universal than we tend to acknowledge. And in a way, migration in a way is something that can contribute, that can inform an aesthetic language that is essentially much more universal and much more inclusive. The other reflection, and I'll stop here, is about modern culture ecologies, contexts. And I think working with colleagues here at the gallery, I have come to realize and to understand this region at first as a bridge between the East and the West, a territory which connects. But on the other hand, it is also a liminal territory because it draws from both sides of the bridge. And it is interesting to understand what the situation is, what is the art historical narrative if we stand on the bridge, if we acknowledge this territory as being liminal, as not being here, not quite there, but somewhere in between. So a place which is open to migration, a place that has witnessed migration over history, over time, perhaps stands for a rich culture ecology, an in-between space, a space which is betwixt and between, which needs to be acknowledged for its richness. And artists like Chagall, I've chosen him because he stands here in the exhibition, and his very complex itinerary all over the world, in a way, is a clear case study to discuss. But I'm sure that there are other artists who can also be equally acknowledged for their unique contribution because of migration aesthetics. The fact that they have migrated, they have moved from territory to territory, the fact that their context is also liminal, that it's shaped by so many influences, by so many cultures, a melting pot of cultures, which is about the bridge, yes, which connects the East and the West, but which we can also acknowledge as a place in between if we stand on the bridge and look East and West to understand the richness of all this. I stop here, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.